Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, Beadwork is Medicine, Strengthening Our Communities with Tammy Wolf. Before we today's conversation is presented with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, and we would like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples, and please feel free to introduce yourself in the nation you're calling in from in the chat. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Srain Squawkin. I am Silk Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory Apache and Belgian settler on my father's side. I'll be the moderator for today's session, and working behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kira, our production assistant. They'll be interacting with everyone in the background. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be emotional or sensitive. Please make sure that you're looking after yourself, and if at any point in time you need to talk to an elder, a friend, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We'll also have some additional support resources in the chat. Now I'll hand it over to Tammy to introduce herself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Srain. Tansiani Bonjour. Hello, I'm Tammy Wolf. Before I begin my introduction, I would first like to acknowledge that I am a guest here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam Nation, as well as visiting the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations as well. As a guest in this territory, I think it's important to acknowledge that I am originally from Treaty 5 in northern Manitoba. I am originally from Norrie House Cree Nation, proud member. I am really, really grateful to be here, and I do want to acknowledge the Learning Circle for inviting me here today to share some of the work that I'm doing. So thank you, thank everybody for bringing me here today. So I guess a little bit about myself. I'll tell you guys a little bit about myself as we go through the session today. So I am a teacher, an educator. I am currently doing a PhD study with Beadwork is Medicine, which is essentially what brought me here today. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how I came to do this work through beadwork. So maybe we'll get the slides up, and you guys are going to learn a little bit more about me. And I'm going to do a bit of an introduction of myself to get us into this session, to get us prepared to talk about Beadwork is Medicine.
Okay. So I'm going to start with storying. So essentially what brought me here and to this work that I'm doing, Beadwork is Medicine, we're going to go a little ways back, not too far back, back to when I was about 8 years old. So when I was 8 years old, I was first exposed to beadwork. And that, seed that was planted inside of me really did take me, it's led me all the way here because as a young person, I was disconnected from my community. I did get raised in child welfare. And so as an 8-year-old being exposed to beadwork, there was something that I did gravitate towards beadwork. And throughout my life, going from 8 years old with beadwork, I did self-teach myself. I mentioned that I was largely disconnected. And so I didn't have teachers. I didn't have elders or knowledge keepers or people that could teach me how to bead. I was exposed to it, and I began to largely self-teach myself. I might date myself a little bit by saying this, but back in my day, there was no TikTok. There was no YouTube. There was no, there was internet. I'm not that old. But there was no access online for me to teach or to learn. So I had to teach myself. And so I did become proficient in what I was doing. I remember going to like powwows and picking up beadwork and trying to look at it. to see how people had made those styles of earrings. I would go and buy those earrings so that I could try to reduplicate, or I could try to figure out through trial and error how to create that beadwork that I'm looking at, which I found to be a skill, right? Self-teaching myself to do that. And oftentimes I was able to. Luckily for me, as I went through on my journey with beadwork, I did find some teachers. So my daughter is going to be 16. But when she was about 2 years old, I did try to learn how to create her power regalia, right? Very interested in my culture and trying to reconnect and have my daughter do that. And so I did pick up some beading stitches throughout that period of time. And I did find a couple teachers that taught me some things, and I strengthened that knowledge, right? Which essentially brought me to my education degree. And as a teacher, as a person who went into education to learn how to teach people, it kind of naturally unfolded. It naturally brought me to a place where I learned how to put my two loves together, right? So I'm getting great at beadwork. I'm learning how to be a teacher, and I kind of just put those two things together, and I started facilitating. Beading workshops to various groups of different people, young people, all the way up to elders. And so I did want to talk a little bit about my lived experience, because as a young person, I mentioned that I was disconnected. As an Indigenous person, I have experienced many systemic barriers. I've pretty much been impacted by every systemic issue that is still impacting Indigenous peoples today. We're going to talk more about some of those things. But really what led me through is really pivoting towards trying to do social justice advocacy because of my lived experience, right? Because of, that inter and multi-generational trauma that impacts Indigenous people. I am very much impacted by that. So, my education, that's what I wanted to do, is I wanted to teach people about these problems, right? These problems that are impacting Indigenous people and myself, right? And even into today, when I think about some of those things that, are still impacting our loved ones, I'm still impacted because my loved ones are impacted, right? And so I think about my consulting company. It works in alignment of the 94 calls to action, and really trying to address some of those things and the reparation. But essentially what that did was it brought me to my master's. And my master's focused on looking at people like myself, who were not involved in the national inquiry, because I am a part of that community. I did lose my mom when I was 18 years old. So my mom was murdered, and that essentially is what brought me to being that community, right? Being involved in that community of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people and their loved ones. And oftentimes when I talk about my master's, people go into academia and they're looking for a degree, right? For me, I feel like that wasn't what I was looking for, right? When I talk about my lived experience, when I talk about the things that I've been impacted by and continue to be impacted by, I really wanted to go into that work focused on telling my mother's story, right? And also telling the stories of other people like myself who were impacted. That work looked largely at policing, actually. And the reason why it looked at policing was because of my mother's murder, and policing failures that are associated with that. So my master's thesis work was called Unheard Voices, and I want to say about halfway through my work, I began to really examine how much impact I could make focusing on policing. When we think about, systemic issues, systemic misjustices, systemic failures, when we think about the problems that are impacting Indigenous people, specifically looking at systems and how to address those problems, it's challenging. These are multi-layered issues, right? And so about halfway through my master's, I began to pivot. I began to, look at elsewhere. And where I began to look was healing. Mm-hmm. So again, that brings me back to this story that I'm telling you guys, right? I'm telling you guys this story about my connection to beadwork and my connection to facilitating these workshops and engaging with Indigenous people like myself who are impacted, by systemic barriers, by social justice issues and all of these different things. And that's where beadwork is medicine really kind of took shape. Was halfway through my master's where I began to pivot and I began to look and see how can I create an impact for people in the community that are like me. And I thought about the things that have helped me to, get where I am and do the things that I'm doing in my advocacy and all of that. And that is essentially beadwork. Beadwork is medicine. And so that's what's brought me here today. That's what has brought me to my research that I'm going to be sharing with you guys here. So let's talk beads, beading, and beadwork. So when we think about beads, beading, and beadwork, first off, glass beads in North America, they date back to the 1700s, right? As we know, beads were introduced through European contact, and they are not a traditional form, right? Because we didn't use glass beads. However, forms of beadwork, weaving, and quillwork were created and practiced by Indigenous people since time immemorial. So these practices have been utilized by Indigenous people across North America, right? Not just here on the Northwest Coast, not just on the plains or within northern communities like mine, but across North America. And there's various ways that Indigenous people did weave, did quill work, did beadwork. Oftentimes, some of the materials that were used were natural materials, right? Seeds. They were created out of bone. They were created out of wood. Different natural materials. Quill work still a traditional practice that is utilized today. And there's different ways in which Indigenous people would utilize beads or why they would bead, why they would weave, why would they create quill work. And one of the ways is ceremonial. So when we think about beading and weaving, that ceremonial aspect has a spiritual connection, right? So I'll use an example of the way that we would do it ceremonial through Cree people would be through, say, Sundance. Right through our sun dances is those beads would have a spiritual connection and they would be utilized in that way to be used in that ceremony, right? Another way is through ornamental, and I want to say this ornamental is still a thing even today, right? Like we like to adorn ourselves ornamentally with our beads. I often talk about looking at dated photos, right? When we look at our ancestors, they're wearing, big, ornate, very complex looking, and it's always big, right? It's always big, and I want to say that's my style. I like it big. I like it bold. I like it saying a statement. I always tell people I like statement pieces, right? And it's very ornamental, and so that's something, like I said, that has been done since time immemorial. That last way is diplomatic. And when I say diplomatic, I always like to go back to the example of the wampum belt, right? So let's go back to the eastern regions of people, right? And this wampum belt is often looked at as the first treaties, right? One misconception that many people believe is that treaty relationships or treaty agreements began with non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people, and that's not true, right? Is that these wampum belts that were created using beads were actually treaty agreements that predated contact. They were created with different nations of people to come together diplomatically, right? And they were agreements. So maybe there was an agreement where they acknowledged they would be in their territory, they would be in their territory, and they would create a wampum belt to outline that agreement in beads in those wampums, so that both sides knew their territories, or it would tell a story in that way of potentially these relationships being built and coming together, having those people build that, right? In that diplomatic way that they would show honor, respect, that relationship that was built between those two people. Because as we're going to learn about beads, it takes a long time. There's something significant that is going into beads, right? And so that way that Indigenous people utilize beads or created beads in ceremonial or ornamental or diplomatic, there's a special meaning, right? Not just creating something for a simple reason, right? So looking at how beadwork can be holistically healing, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So for those of you watching, I hope that you guys are familiar with this model here. So this model is the medicine wheel. And as we can see the medicine wheel here, it is a very well-known model that represents a few different things. So one of the things would be that it represents Indigenous worldview, right? That we're looking at the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, and that these four quadrants represent different things, right? When we look at the medicine wheel, often some of the teachings that come out of the medicine wheel is balance, right? Is that what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. We're going to talk more about that as I take you guys through Beadwork is Medicine. But these quadrants all represent something. And I felt like the medicine wheel is a really good model to represent the healing or that holistic healing of beadwork, because you can look at each quadrant and they represent something. So let's look at the physical. Let's start with the physical. So the physical is just that. It's the practical application of beadwork. So when we think about the physical, we're utilizing our eyes, we're utilizing our hands to bead, to weave, to use thread, to how we're actually physically, practically applying our beads. But what's more distinct about the physical is we're looking at fine motor. And when I say fine motor skills, this takes me back to when I worked in a kindergarten nursery classroom. I don't know if anybody else has been in a kindergarten nursery classroom where you're trying to teach 4 and 5-year-olds how to cut paper with scissors. I don't know if you guys have. It's a lot more challenging than you think, right? Why? Because young people have trouble with their fine motor, right? Is that they're just learning how to utilize their hands and how to have that hand-to-eye coordination and that fine motor skills. Another example would be elders. Earlier, I talked about how I have taught beadwork workshops to, 3 years old all the way up to elders. They also need help with their fine motor. They need to keep, their hands going. And so oftentimes you'll see elders that do that, right? And even going back to those 3-year-olds, thinking about how you can adapt. You can adapt beadwork. People think like you've taught to 3-year-olds, right? But we're all learning, right? We're going to talk more about that. But not only are we using the practical application, using our hands, using our fine motor skills, but any beadwork artist will tell you that you utilize your whole body when you're doing beadwork. Because when you're up at 4 o'clock in the morning with one eye open trying to thread that needle, your back is stiff, your neck is sore, you're trying to find a comfortable space or a spot with your whole body, because you are actually using your whole physical, right? And there is something there, maybe even needing to have a rest, right? Rest your body after beading, because sometimes it can get tense. You're trying to work something, or you're getting frustrated, which essentially takes me to the second quadrant here, which is the mental. So the mental way that beadwork takes shape is through the teaching of patience. So anybody will tell you, I don't know how many people have actually practiced beadwork, but beadwork can be quite frustrating. Just a little bit frustrating. I hear this time and time again. I hear, in my workshops, in my beading circles with different people who are learning how to bead. Sometimes people will quit because they haven't learned that teaching. They haven't learned that patience yet. And I really do believe, that mental aspect of patience, that's what it's teaching you, that frustration, that tangled thread, those needle pricks, that blood, sweat, and tears that goes into your beading. It is patience, and the amount of time that it takes for people will see beadwork and they won't understand the patience that it has taken to actually create that piece of beadwork, because it does take a long time, right? And so I always talk about that patience, that mental patience that it takes to actually facilitate, that practical application, that physical application of doing the beading. But one more thing that's super important when we think about the mental aspect is also decision making. And when I say decision making, I want to say designing, because when we think about designing, oftentimes people will see beadwork and they'll just think, oh, well, that looks simple or that looks easy. But people don't realize the amount of time that it takes to create, right? And even before, one of the things that I often teach in my workshops is that the amount of time it takes to actually plan out and decide those decisions prior to even picking up that needle, prior to picking up that needle and thread and going with those beads, stringing those beads and tacking them down or stringing them up to have different styles. You're making decisions. You're making decisions on color. You're making decisions based on the design, whether you're going to string them on a loop just on using thread, or you're going to use material that you're going to tack down. Oftentimes, a lot of beadwork artists will design them and they'll draw pictures, right? Or they'll print out pictures that other artists have created and then bead using that. But there's a lot of decision making that goes in prior to even actually physically doing the practicing of beadwork, which also brings me to math skills. So when we think about the mental aspects, math skills are huge. And I don't think a lot of people can see how math can be utilized, because you're like, what do you mean you're using math? Well, it's not just deciding the sizes, but we're also constantly counting the beads. And when I think about the math skills, like when you think about earrings, I do a lot of earrings, but not just earrings, moccasins or leggings. All of these things have in common that there's two of them. So you have to do the first one, and then you're trying to create, like the medicine wheel, that balance. You're trying to create a mirrored image of that same design that you created. And your math skills are going to be counting because you're looking at your beads, right? If you put 2 extra beads in there, it's not going to look mirrored. It's not going to look the same, right? So you're counting and you're trying to decide. There's another example that I utilized is I did a workshop with some high school students, grade 9 students, and they did loom work. And that loom work is structured, right? You have this loom like 5 across, like maybe 20 across. But we utilize math skills in trying to decide the color and the design of how they were going to create their design. So, 3 up and then 3 down, or 5 across and 3 up, right? Just trying to decide and thinking about, because that's what it is. It's repetition. So you're constantly utilizing those skills and counting and counting and counting. And that's one of the things we'll talk more about that when we get into the next slide. But it brings me to the emotional. So when we think about this repetition of, math skills, are when we're practically applying these skills to bead, what's happening is we're really inside of our minds. And we're inside of our inner dialogue, right? Our emotions, right? Oftentimes people tell me that beadwork is meditative, right? So not only are you counting, or you're doing a repeating task, you're also sitting with yourself. So you're having a lot of inner dialogue, and what you're doing is you're building strength in that inner dialogue, positive inner dialogue. I want to say this happens after you get past the frustrating part, because maybe your inner dialogue might not be so happy in the first stages of learning how to do beadwork, because it can be a little bit frustrating. But this is once you've got into that repetition, once you've kind of gotten into that calming state, right? That emotional balance, again, going back to the medicine wheel, where you're feeling like you're centering yourself, right? In that positive way of thinking, because you're seeing it come together, right? A stitch after stitch, which brings me to the spiritual. So the spiritual aspect of beadwork really is that connection. And when I say that connection, I mean that connection to who you are as an Indigenous person. Like, so when I talk about myself, right, that spiritual connection that I found was connected to Indigenous ways of knowing, even before I recognized that I was connecting to that. Because earlier I talked about not having knowledge keepers. I talked about not having elders. I talked about not having a teacher that was going to teach me how to do beadwork. And the way that I always look at how I connected to beadwork was really through my ancestors, was really through that spiritual connection that I have as an Indigenous person, because I do believe that was guiding me, right? I feel like that is a gift that was given to me, right? One of the ways that I often talk about that is through blood memory. So when we talk about blood memory, sometimes people talk about, inter and multi-generational trauma being passed on through the blood. One of the things that I always try to remind people is that our resiliency and our those positive ways of thinking, being, doing, seeing also pass through our blood, right? And so I often go back to that spiritual connection that I had to my ancestors, and I hear other artists talk about that a lot, about how that's where they look to strength, right? And so there is a very significant spiritual connection when you're thinking about connecting to beads, and we're going to talk more about that. So this is actually my conceptual framework that I developed for my PhD. This is going to lead me into my PhD. And this conceptual framework was actually created utilizing the medicine wheel, which I just showed you guys. So looking at that mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, the mind, spirit, emotions, and body, looking at yourself in the center, and utilizing these other aspects that I'm going to take you through in the next slides. The way that I developed this was I actually utilized my educational lens as a teacher, right? I talked about my love of teaching and beadwork and how those came together. And I focused on using Dr. Martin Brokenleg's Circle of Courage. So I don't know if there's any educators out there who are watching, but this Circle of Courage is actually utilized to engage Indigenous students into the education system, right? And so, like, what are those things that Indigenous students need to thrive? Like, what do they need to be successful in the classroom? And I felt like these things really kind of took shape and came together and really connected with beadwork. So I'm going to take you through some of these things here, and we're going to start with identity and culture. So when we think about identity and culture, we're really thinking about how beadwork is culturally immersive, right? So that cultural immersion that we get when we are engaging with our beads. And what it does is it really strengthens those things that I talked about, right? It strengthens our Indigenous ways of thinking, of seeing, of doing, and being, right? It's connecting us to building a stronger connection to our identity and our Indigenous culture, right? Language, traditions, all of these different aspects of our identity that essentially, was taken. Right? When we think about trying to strengthen our cultural immersion through beadwork, we're really connecting to those things that were taken, right? When you're sitting in beading circles and you're with other people, you're connecting with them, and you're connecting with who you are. You're connecting to your culture. You're connecting to potential different language-based systems, other traditions. We'll talk more about that. And really, what it does when we think about cultural immersion is it looks to dismantle that displacement and that removal of traditional forms of identity. Right? When we think about those traditional forms of identity that were taken through assimilation, we're connecting. And the reason I know that is because of the way that beadwork helped me, right? I think about how I was disconnected from who I was. I really didn't know who I was as a young person. And I always think about going back to the beads and going back to, oftentimes I did put my beads down. There were times, there were time periods within my life that I wasn't healthy enough to pick up my beads, or I wasn't, mentally, right, or emotionally in a place to be able to connect with those beads, right? But those beads were always there, pulling me back to, telling me who I am, right? And trying to again connect me to my culture and my identity and who I was, because I was disconnected, because I was displaced, right? I was, and my identity, I really struggled with my identity. I really struggled with who I was as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous youth, even into my young adulthood, right? But not only does it culturally immerse, or strengthen identity, it's really also looking at worldview. So when we think about worldview, what it does is it really fosters relationality with ourselves and with others in our world. So when we think about how Indigenous people, like some of those ways that I talked about myself, right, is that many people are impacted negatively or have the negative effects of colonialism, right? And in turn have a repressed view of ourselves or others or our communities and the outside world and society. I think about myself and I think about how I didn't, not knowing myself, and then also thinking about that potential internalized colonization, right? Because Indigenous people were that forced assimilation, right? Thinking about the effects of residential schools, thinking about child apprehension, myself having lived experience in the child welfare system. My mom was also a part of the 60s scoop, right? And so really thinking about how, beadwork looks to change that. And not only does it look to change that within ourselves when we're actively engaging with beadwork, I also always say that this is also a way for other people to appreciate, right? That's why I call it beadwork is medicine. I don't just say beading is medicine because it's not just the application. It's that when I wear my beads, I feel good. I feel good about myself. I feel proud of who I am as an Indigenous person. And it makes me feel good when people say, like, oh, I love your earrings, right? There's certain earrings that I will wear where people will stop me on the street and they'll say, oh, those are beautiful. Those are gorgeous. Did you make those? Oftentimes they're not. They're not my beadwork, but because I do love to share and build my collection of other artists. But it's doing that work. It's fostering those good feelings, and it's creating a better worldview. One of the things that I have often said throughout the years is that if only people could see how beautiful our Indigenous culture is, right? And that's how we can see that, right? That's how we can change that worldview. And so beadwork is medicine can really help to facilitate that change through those positive individual actions, and really trying to move towards healing, which we're going to talk more about. So storytelling and traditional knowledge. So when we think about beadwork, and we're sitting in circles, right? We're looking at these oral traditions, right? Practicing beadwork teaches us not only about Indigenous culture and identity, what I just mentioned, but it also holds stories from Indigenous nations, right? That different people carry. There's different knowledge keepers, elders, or beadwork artists that carry a variety of teachings. And when I say this, I mean that Indigenous people are going to sit in different circles with different people, right? And one of the things that I often talk about when I talk about oral tradition is that I never have a script. I don't have a script when I'm facilitating beading workshops because I feel like the ancestors are there with me. I feel like those teachings that happen, they happen organically. They just come out, right? They're just shared with people. And it almost seems to just fit that moment, right, with those people and that those Indigenous ways of knowing, or that transmission of generational knowledge, that wisdom, those teachings, that storytelling, it happens organically and they just come out. And oftentimes what happens is I'm sharing my teachings, I'm sharing what I know, and then the people that I'm sitting with, they share their knowledge, they share what they know, right? And so it's just this organic happening, right? That maybe I'll share a ceremony teaching that I know and somebody else will. And it'll create a domino effect, right? Where everybody and that's how language comes out. That's how, these stories come out. And even in itself, like beadwork is a traditional practice, right? It's that generational knowledge that's been passed on from generation to generation to generation. But not only are we learning oral traditions, we're connecting with storytelling and traditional knowledge, we're also learning and teaching. And when I say learning and teaching, we're learning things about ourselves. And when I say we're learning things about ourselves is we're going through that story, our own story, right? And we're learning about ourselves through that. One of the teachings I talked a little bit earlier about when we looked at the mental is patience. I talked about that script. I don't have a script. There's something that I always share. And that first teaching that I share is about patience, right? Is that you gotta get through that frustration first to get to the good stuff. You gotta have patience, right? And there's really only two rules in beadwork. And I hate that word rules. It sounds rigid and structured. I don't like that word, but it's the best word that I can use. The first rule is patience. And the second rule is don't tangle your bead thread. And the reason why I say the second one is don't tangle your bead thread is because if you tangle your bead thread, you'll have to revert back to rule number one, which is patience. Because any artist will tell you that you don't want to have to you don't want to have to snip your thread, right? You want to be able to have patience to kind of untangle those knots. I spend a lot of workshops trying to untangle knots for people because they don't want to snip, right? So again, that's part of the story, right? That's part of the learning. That's part of the teaching, right? As you're going through. And really, when we think about, this learning and teaching, we're really learning through beadwork about who we are, right? I talked about identity and culture. I talked about, this traditional knowledge that kind of just comes out organically. We're learning about ourselves through these stories, and we're learning about who we are as we're practicing beadwork. Which brings me to building relationships and sense of belonging. So when we think about relationships, we're really thinking about how we can build and strengthen our relationship with all my relations and building relationships with one another. So one of the things when we think about building relationships, we often think about building relationships with each other, right? We think about building relationships with other people. And when I say build relationships, that also means all my relations. So all my relations is really our connection to everything, right? It means our connection to everything and how everything is connected and everything has a purpose. And so one of the things that I often share in my beading workshops is I talk about how even spirit, our beads have spirit. Right. And oftentimes when you talk to beading artists, they'll talk about how beads are living, right? And that they have this spirit and they're animate, right? Through our language, we know that. And so we have to build and strengthen that relationship to our beads and through that, all my relations, right? And that understanding that everything is connected, right? But it also helps us to build those relationships with each other. It fosters, it strengthens and builds upon those learned teachings that we talked about, identity, culture, and languages. That storytelling, it builds those relationships to those traditional based teachings, right? So that we can share them, so that we can hold them, we can carry them. And that's really, again, building that relationship to all my relations and strengthening our understanding of that. When we think about how indigenous nations, we have to connect with our culture. We need to find out who we are in order to build those relationships with ourselves, with our community, and find a sense of belonging again. That relationship isn't just about that relationship with others. It's not just that relationship with the beads. It's not just a relationship with all my relations. It's a relationship with ourselves, right? So when we go back to those teachings that I just talked about, right? We're learning about ourselves, and sometimes we need to build that relationship with ourselves. Sometimes we need to relearn who we are, right? I talked about my disconnection to my identity and culture. I talked about how I didn't even know myself, right? I didn't even know who I was. And I feel like I found myself and I built a strong relationship with myself through my beads because it helped me within the circles. It helped me with other people. But then I also would go home and I would bead by myself. And when I talked about that inner dialogue, right, I talked about that emotional connection and that strength that you build in there with yourself, right? So again, beading it's so much deeper than just, this relationship, because it's relational. There's a relation happening there, right? Let's talk more about sense of belonging. So those relationships are with everybody, but it's also, again, that sense of belonging. So when people sit in beading circles, they're building those relationships with others. They're connecting with other people, but they're also finding a community. They're finding a place to connect with others where they feel like they belong. And not only are they finding where they belong, but they're connecting with those beads. And so those beads might go home with them, right? So oftentimes you think about how people, beading can be a bit addictive. I talked about 4 a.m. with my one eye trying to thread the needle. And that relationship that you begin to build with those beads, you'll take those beads from the beading circle, you'll take them home. And that essentially ultimately helps to branch out to the broader community. So you're bringing your beads home, and then it's coming to other people. And that's how that relationship can begin to build and branch out to the broader community, because maybe your auntie gets interested, maybe your sister, maybe your mom, maybe your cousin, right? Maybe they'll see that, and that sense of belonging with those beads is building, because then those people will be like, oh, well, where are you going to bead? And then they'll want to come to the beading circle. Then they'll that community is building. Those people are building that stronger sense of belonging, and then more relationships get built. More people are at those beading circles, right? And essentially what these relationships, this all my relations, and this relationship with the beads and other people and this community and this sense of belonging that's beginning to happen, it begins to address the sense of loss that's felt by Indigenous people due to that displacement from homelands, from culture, and identity. So earlier I talked about, my disconnection. I talked about being, in CFS, being emancipated youth. My mom was involved in that 60s scoop. And so when we think about this displacement, we can take it all the way back to, forced removal on reserves, right? We can take it back to when Indigenous people were forced. They were forced to be away. And this can begin to rebuild that sense of belonging, right? Because Indigenous people feel that, right? When we think about how this sense of belonging also helps, we can go back to how it's often described, this displacement, it's often described as feeling as if something is missing. I feel like this is our spirit, right? When I go back to the medicine wheel, and I talked about those quadrants and that spirit, that's that spirit there. That's how, when we build that sense of belonging with our beads, we're bringing ourselves back to our spirit. We're bringing ourselves back to who we are. I often quote Jessie Thistle. I don't know if anybody has heard of the Indigenous definition of homelessness. I've also experienced homelessness as a youth, and that displacement from those traditional homelands, from being away from our families, through residential schools, through CFS, through the 60s scoop, that's where we need to return to. We need to return back to our spirit so that we can connect. And beadwork is going to take us through that, with that identity, with that culture, with that storytelling, with that building relationships, that sense of belonging. And really what it does, it strengthens our spiritual connection and our belonging, right? So then and we can feel it. We can feel our spirit being ignited. Oftentimes when we think about colonialism, it's created this lack of belonging, this marginalization where Indigenous people have been pushed off to the side. It's manifested in negative social justice issues, in building that marginalization through socioeconomic conditions, impacting Indigenous people. When we think about how beadwork can help build relationships, this sense of belonging, really what it's looking to address is issues within the justice system, within CFS, within gangs, within addictions and poverty. Because when we think about, for example, when we look at gangs, what is the reason why people go into gangs? They're looking for a sense of belonging. They're looking for a place that they can connect with other people who are like themselves. And so how is beadwork going to be helpful? It's going to give somebody else an outlet, something positive, something that's going to take them away from, those negative ways of thinking, being, doing, and seeing, right? Gangs, addictions, those negative things that have pulled, because that's what Indigenous people are seeking. They're seeking a sense of belonging. They're seeking a place where they can feel like, I'm okay. This is where I want to be. And these people are like me, right? So when we go to beading circles, that's what happens, right? And more people want to join these circles, and there's more people, and it just flourishes, right? We'll talk more about that. Which leads me to mastery and leadership. So mastery, when we think about mastery really is it's never about being better than others. It's really about learning about ourselves. So when we think about mastering, right, we think about master, I'm going to be a master of my craft. It's really about mastering that individual craft. So how you want to do it, because it's always up to you, right? It's not, oftentimes when I teach my beading circles, I talk to people and I say, oh, well, I can teach you the stitches, but I can't teach you how to work with the beads, right? I can't tell you which colors to use or give you the designs. That's up to you, right? That's up to the person who is trying to master that individual craft. And it's really about being confident. And that's why I always give choice when I teach beading workshops, because giving choice allows people to be confident in what they want to do, what they want to create. And again, going back to that mental aspect of decision making and using people's math skills, right? It's all interrelated, it's all interconnected. And so when people make their own choices, they can think, oh, well, I've mastered this because I made the choice. I picked these colors. Wow, this looks amazing, right? And essentially it leads into strengthening a positive view of oneself, right? So then people begin to, when they create something, they begin to feel very positive about it. They begin to feel like, wow, I made this. Like, oh my gosh, I've created this beautiful work of art. And it just gives positive feelings. It gives encouragement. It gives them, oh, well, maybe if I've done this, maybe I can do something even more challenging, right? And so again, that's where that mastery gets built. It gets built, and it starts here, and it kind of just keeps going, right? Because it's almost like a new challenge. And, oh, well, maybe I can incorporate a different kind of stuff. Maybe I can put shells in. Maybe I'll use different size beads. There's so many different ways that people can master what they're creating, right? And really what mastery does is it combats the disempowerment which stems from negative government legislations and those oppressed societal views, that internal dialogue or that colonial worldview. Earlier, I talked about internalized colonization. Right. I talked about that repressed view of how people might view themselves. Right. And how, government, had that forced removal into residential schools where culture and identity was stripped. It was taken. Indigenous people weren't encouraged to create, cultural art or anything like that. And so when we think about this mastery, it really is going against this disempowerment that Indigenous people are feeling, because they're beginning to say, like, I can do this. I know this is what you've told me that I'm capable of doing, but this is what I'm learning. This is what I've learned, and this is what I'm learning to do, right? So once people begin to master and they begin to recognize how they can create, it also leads into leadership. So essentially, beadwork strengthens that mastery, and then it builds into learned leadership by helping others. And this is probably my favorite aspect of facilitating beading circles, beading workshops with people, because this is when it gets very quiet. And the people who are in the workshop, they stop asking me. And the reason why they stop asking me is because they begin to ask the person next to them. So they stop asking me, the instructor. And that's essentially learned leadership, because the person that they ask, maybe they're looking at their beadwork, maybe they see how far they've gotten, and they're like, "Oh, well, you're doing so well with your beadwork. Can you help me?" And so this is amazing for me as the facilitator and instructor, because I can just stand off to the side and I can now watch again this strengthen of these building of relationships, right? And this person who has mastered and feels confident enough to say, "Hey, yeah, you know what? I can help you." And they begin to help to show them how to do this beadwork. And so essentially what's happening here is they're learning, and then they're gifting their work to others. And when I say they're gifting to others, so this does mean giving away their beadwork. So they've mastered, okay? They've created something beautiful. And that Indigenous teaching is when you make something for the first time, you're supposed to give it away. You're supposed to gift it. Right. And so often when people are in these workshops and they create something, they say, "Oh, well, I'm going to give it to my auntie, or I'm going to give it to my mom. I'm going to give it to my sister, my cousin, somebody special." Right. And they gift that away. But I think what is most important as well is that they can teach. They can teach that now, right? So again, there's that learned leadership where that person is now gifting that learned stitch or how they've learned how to beadwork to others, and they don't even see that that's a gift. They don't even see that they're giving away that gift that they've learned, right? And it's really connecting us to that holistic way of healing, because it's making you feel good, right? It's making you feel good that you've mastered something. You're learning leadership. You're giving that away, right? And not only are you giving away that beadwork, whether that's in a gift form like this, or you're giving away, you go home and you're like, "Mom, I went to this great workshop," or whoever you're talking to, and I'm going to teach you. We should learn how to do this, right? But it's also those stories. It's also allowing those sharing of stories. It's allowing, those gifts that have been given, those traditional teachings, and continuing to practice beadwork, because you're also doing that yourself. So if you leave that beading circle with those skills, you're going to continue using them, right? And that's a gift that's essentially inside of yourself. And essentially what that does is it continues to master, or you learn new skills. So sometimes people who already have skills, they come and then they're building, right? They're building on those skills. And then maybe potentially other people at that beading circle will have other skills that they'll teach, right? And it goes on and on and on. And so when we think about mastery and leadership, we're really thinking about how we're all just learning, right? We're all just learning, and we're all lifelong learners, because even myself, I've been beading since I was 8 years old, and I still have things to learn, right? So that's one of those teachings that I have gained, is that, we're here on our physical journey from the spirit world, and that we're here seeking knowledge, right? And I'm not going to stop learning until I go back, until I return back to the spirit world. And so I'm still just learning, right? I'm still just learning how to master that. And I'm always going to be a lifelong learner, even if I'm out there teaching beadwork and I'm helping to teach other people so that they can learn. I'll always I'll always still be on this journey, right? So really it brings me to strengthening our community. So all of those things together, right? It starts with self. It starts with that mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and that identity and culture, all of those things together. Individuals are gaining different teachings. They're building relationships. They're fostering a sense of belonging with each other, their identity, their culture, and their relationality. Communities are being strengthened through all of these actions together. Becoming proficient in beadwork is healing ourselves. It's finding out who we are as Indigenous people. It's reclaiming our identity and our culture. And then we're giving away those gifts, right? All of those gifts, not just the physical gifts. And when we think about going back to self, right, that model that I showed you guys, and that self is in the middle, when that healed person, as I talked about my healing journey through beadwork, becomes aware of themselves, like I have, I wanted to give those things away, right? Mm-hmm. Those people that have healed can help to share that with other people, what they've learned. And we can see that our communities can begin to flourish. And they are flourishing through this resurgence of healing that is taking place through teaching and learning beadwork. Ako se, kailan ask kamitin?
Questions. Oh my God, that was amazing. It's so cool to I think just hearing and just validating a lot of beaders, because I think we all know how healing beadwork is for our people, and how meaningful it is. Like you said, for a lot of our community members that have not grown up with culture and whatnot, right. It's a great way to connect. And like you said, a lot of intentionality goes in there, and being self-aware, and definitely if you're doing pairs, you have to self-reflect on okay, this one's not looking as great as this one, but
yes,
but you're able to reflect for others pairs or whatnot, and just build that mastery, like you were saying, and start being a leader for everyone else, which is cool. It's such a communal thing, and I think that's what our ancestors would have wanted, right? We would have been doing that this time of the year, we right. would be having
winter time.
Yeah, the storytelling, like you were saying, especially with the wampum. Yeah, and then I didn't even know that, and that's so cool, to hear about that. But we have a ton of questions here. This first one is there a reason why so many artists work with seed beads over the varying sizes of beads, or is it just a preference?
I think it's probably just a preference. Myself included in seed beads. I love my seed beads. I have tried the smaller, so I think those are about size 10 is the regular size seed bead. I've tried the 13s and the 15s. It is so much more challenging to use different size beads. And I think it is definitely just preference. Some people like delica beads, which are the square cut beads, and then just variations of different styles or sizes. But yeah, I definitely feel like I gravitate towards just the regular seed beads, and I don't really actually know why. I think it is just preference. Yeah.
I feel like I've only beaded a handful of times, but I know from my friends who kind of do between seed beads and delica, from what I know that they've told me, they like seed beads is because if something's just a little bit off, you can search for a little bead or a big bead to fill that one spot that you need just for the end. So
that's a really good teaching.
Yeah.
That's an organic teaching that often comes out, is that, those misshapen beads, those beads that are off, maybe people think oh, that's a weird looking bead, I'm going to throw it out. No, you keep those beads.
Yeah.
Because those beads are, those beads teach us about humility, right? And that nothing in life is perfect, and that, Creator has all given us these beautiful gifts, and that, you know, that's what that bead's gift is that it can fit perfectly into that little spot, that little space, and it has a purpose. Right? Yeah, I love that. You just led me to that teaching.
I think I remember complimenting someone's earrings once, and they had everything almost perfect, and there was like one color off, and I was like, I like that, and they're like, yeah, I intentionally did that, and I'm like, oh, like, how come? They're like, oh, because of nothing's perfect. And
there's also the spirit bead.
Yeah,
did they intentionally put a spirit bead?
Yeah, I think that's what they said. Yes, yeah, and I was like, that's so cool. I didn't know that teaching. I just like that it was off. Like,
yeah, I think that some people do it intentionally, but I also think that there is the teaching that, you know, it just slips in, and that is another humility teaching where it's like, nothing can be perfect, right? So even when that's why I said about mastery, I think that mastery, it's really important that people understand that it's not about being better than anybody, because we need to be humble, and that even when you compare both sides, oh, well, this one looks a lot better than this side. You're trying to master that, but remembering that nothing can be perfect in life, and that spirit bead that lines up in there, you have all these beautiful beads, and then all of a sudden this is not the same color. Yeah. This is off white. This is not white. All these beads are supposed to be white. Where did that guy come from? That's the spirit bead.
Yeah. It's funny too, because I asked my grandma and my sister to make me grad moccasins for one of my grads. I don't remember. And I knew exactly who made which.
Really?
Like, because my grandma, like, has been beading for, like, a long time. My sister, not nearly as much. But you could tell, like, I appreciated both just as much. Like, because, like, for the amount of, like, work that went into it. But I liked that, like, one was, like
a little bit different.
Yeah. Like, you could tell grandma's, like, oh, like, but my sister's, like, she put a lot of work into it. And she did, like, really good. Like, I couldn't have made it look nearly as good like that for grandma's. So I liked it.
Beautiful.
Speaking of elderly and our older community members, we have next question. What would you recommend to use for aging beaders to see your beading project? This person has
headlamp.
Just a headlamp.
Headlamp.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
I would definitely say headlamp. I'm almost there. I'm almost there with getting a headlamp. I think some tattoo artists also use the headlamp, and people have suggested it to me, so that you can, because it really has to do with like the lighting. Like, is the light going to be bright enough for you to be able to see it?
Yeah.
I have also seen aging beaders use like I don't know if it's like the bivocal. You could just buy those to kind of see closer to be able to look.
Yeah.
I myself, I don't know. I wear contacts, so maybe I think I'll get there too soon. But definitely headlamp, because if the light is bright enough, I think that should help.
Okay, cool. And then probably like something that magnifies it.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. Great. And then this person just wants to know a little bit more about like blood memory, or if you know any more. And you touched on it in the presentation, just if you had anything else to add.
So something that I often share in my classes that I teach on like our culture and history is that, you know, blood memory is coursing through our veins. Is that, you know, sometimes when we ask ourselves, like, how did I know that?
Yeah.
That's how, right? Mm-hmm. When we think about how, as I mentioned in the presentation, I talked about how, you know, we talk about inter and multi-generational trauma, and it's like, well, how did that happen, right? Mm-hmm. That's why multi-generational trauma is a thing, because it can skip a generation. Mm-hmm. So my daughter's grandfather went to residential school, but her dad did not. Mm-hmm. Is she still impacted by his residential school's experience? Yes, very much so, even though it skipped that generation, because it's in the blood, right? So blood memory, again, isn't just our traumas. It's not just those negative things. it's our resiliency, it's who we are, it's our identity, it's our culture. And I do feel that our blood memory also is that spiritual connection to our ancestors. That's one of the things that I teach in my class as well. I play this really amazing video. It's called Legacy. And it talks about the ancestors. That's how the video starts. My ancestors, my grandmother, right?
Yeah.
And it talked about how this generational knowledge is passed on through the grandmothers.
Yeah.
But the way that I connect is because I never knew my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm still connected to her through my blood memory, right?
Yeah.
I am connected in that way. And I do feel like that captures that. Right?
Yeah. Well, like, I feel like there's a few things that you touched on. Well, like, I think like what you were kind of saying about like intuition.
Right.
Like that's like,
Yes.
that seems like a solid thing for blood memory. And then also, I forget where I read this, but like your grandmother had you in her eggs.
Right.
Like,
absolutely.
Back then, so like
it's very philosophical, right?
Like,
So
already
it's
like connected, you know? So
yes.
It's like, whoa, like,
even if I didn't know her, she carried me inside of her.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. It's symbolic. There's spiritual, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's very interesting. So we have another question here. So this person says they have recently been asked to host a workshop on beading for non-Indigenous folks, and they have some apprehension for sharing this knowledge with non-Indigenous folk because of how much was being taken from us. What is your view, advice, guidance on teaching non-Indigenous folk beadwork?
I think that there's a difference between appreciation and appropriation, right? So there's a difference between those two things. And I think that beading with non-Indigenous people, those are our teachings. Our teachings are that we are generous. Our teachings that we are giving. Our teachings are that we build those relationships and that we want to engage with other people. And we're always welcoming, right? That's who we are as Indigenous people. So I think that's great. That's reconciliation, right? Happening there, right? Reconciliation in action. But with that being said, when we think about appropriation, that's, teaching non-Indigenous people these skills so that they can benefit in some way, that they can sell this, or they can now begin to run with this and go in that direction. And again, there's a definite line between appreciation and appropriation, right? And we need to really, really be mindful about how we do that in a good way, right? Yeah. Appreciate rather than appropriate.
Yeah, definitely. And just being mindful if that person's going to use you as like on their, like if they do start selling stuff, like, and then start using you like, oh, I was taught by an Indigenous person. Because sometimes that's kind of like, oh, like that's not your seal of approval. You're not an ally.
That's appropriation, right?
Yeah,
Which is and it's unfortunate that we actually even have to talk about that, because that is unfortunately a thing that does happen, right?
Yeah,
so with that being said, I highly encourage appreciation.
Definitely. And like, just as a recommendation, I think like for anyone who's going to be signing up for your workshop, maybe like having each of those people donate like a certain amount to a youth group or an elder group, just as a way of giving back to the community, because you'll be, or even also opening it up to Indigenous folks.
That's, I honestly believe that, like, especially too, if there's going to be workshops, like they want to pass on those skills, they should be welcoming an Indigenous person in to further that, right? To further those teachings and pass on that generational knowledge, rather than, okay, well, you've learned to bead and you want to continue these workshops. Well, you have these skills. You should be respecting and honoring Indigenous traditions by welcoming another Indigenous person in to come and continue that work. Yeah, definitely. Pass on those traditions.
Yes. And then we have another question here. What holistic preparations do you undertake to ensure a successful, fulfilling process, like with your challenging beading projects? Do you really want to know?
I think that there are a few different teachings that are associated with beading, in the sense that some people say that bead when you're in a bad state of mind. There's other people that I know that have said, like my friend, for example, she lost her baby, and how did she heal through that? By creating, by utilizing it as a tool, right? So I think that's really up to the person. For myself, I've kind of gone in and gone without. So when my auntie passed away, I didn't bead for like a year. And that was, I think, 2020, which is really odd because it was during COVID when we didn't have a lot to do. I couldn't connect. There was something, like I had cut my hair too. And so, yeah, it's like, I guess the preparation for me is in that moment, I felt like I needed to heal, right? But then on the other hand, I've also used it as healing. So do I think that there is like a one clear cut way that I prepare? You gotta be in a really comfortable spot. You have to have something. I always have something here in front of me. And then a good, like, so that your beads are not rolling. And lighting. Like I mentioned earlier, you definitely have to have good lighting. I like to bead during the day when there is good lighting and an open window. I think, honestly, I feel like natural light is the best light. So in the night, when it's I keep telling you guys, it's a thing.
Definitely. I was just thinking, like, when you were talking about like your stance and stuff, would you recommend like those sit-stand desks? Because I think a lot of people are now working from home. Like if they have their beading mat here and then just doing it there, or is that?
I bead in front of the TV. I think I like, some people do it with music on. I like TV because, and I usually put on something that I already know, like that I've seen. So that, because you're not looking at the TV, you're just looking at your project and then you're listening. I have one of those sit-down desks. I do that, like I work from home often. So I mean, I think that would be good if you like to be at a table. I personally want to be on a chair or a couch, something soft. The bed, man, not so great. You kind of need to be sitting up. It'll relax you and put you to sleep for sure. Yes. But yeah, I think everybody just kind of needs to find their groove. Because again, I can only tell you guys what I do or what I like, and everybody's different, right? Everybody has their way, and that's okay. And that's an organic teaching as well that just kind of came out. So just try to find what works best for you because there's no rules, right? To beadwork.
Yes, very true. And then our next question is, were beads used for trading amongst Indigenous folks back in the day?
I can't tell you specifically from, like, I can't cite literature on that, but I would like to say yes in reference to the wampum because that was a thing before. So, but again, I can't cite literature on that.
And then our next question is, have you ever gotten into a slump where you felt like you couldn't, I guess you couldn't talk about that. About my auntie mom, So there was a very large disconnect. That was my mom's sister. So this person's just like wondering, do you think just taking a break is best, or were there any other recommendations to help when you were in your slump? Like, did you do any other things to kind of? I like the land. Yes, absolutely. So so I just let my beads, and I think I did talk about that when I also started my presentation, as I talked about how I went years without touching my beads. So when I was a youth in care, like I was emancipated at 15 years old. And so there were periods of time in there where I was just in crisis, right? Like I was couch surfing for a while. There were periods where I didn't touch my beads. But they were always there. They always welcomed me back too. And so I think that if you're in the state of mind, like mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, where you feel that you don't feel like you want to connect with your beads, I think it's really up to you to try to figure out when you will be, because my beads always welcome me back, right? And so I think it was about a year, and I think it was also kind of odd as well, because
I don't even think I recognized that I hadn't touched my beads until the end of the year. And because my auntie passed away in January.
Mm-hmm.
And then December time came around and everybody knows that I bead. So everybody was like, I need Christmas gifts. Like, do you have any beadwork? Like, or have you been beading?
Yeah.
And that was when I clued in, like, I haven't even beaded all year.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't even realize that my own spirit was telling me that I shouldn't, I didn't want to be with my beads.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this is just a personal, your own personal journey, right? That story, your own story where you connect with the beads and what is that going to look like best for you?
Yes, that's so true. We have our next question is, this person noticed beadwork sometimes has a pattern of colors such as red, orange, yellow, and like blue, turquoise. Is there like a cultural reason for this, or?
So the red, orange, yellow, white, those are the fire colors. So one of the teachings that I often share is Ininiw Iskwew, which is a Cree. Iskwew is fire. Iskwew is for the women. And I know there are a lot of women beaders.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is an organic teaching that just comes out because of the way that they blend.
Mm-hmm.
And so the teaching is that women originated from the fire. So Iskwew is woman, and Iskwew sounds very similar. They say that the women originated from that fire. And so I think fire colors, and they just look beautiful, don't they?
Yeah.
And then I think blending with either black or turquoise, blue, it just makes it pop against the fire color.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's a teaching that I know, but
that's really
again,
beautiful.
That's just my own teachings.
Well, even like the language, I love that. Like, this other person, they want to start a beading circle in their community.
Wonderful.
But it's in California. But many of the tribes represented in the community, in the space, no one currently has any experience with beading. Do you have any recommendations on like how to start learning and like what supplies and like what's the first project to start with? Like,
I feel like there is so much information on the internet now. Like, if you want to learn, like when I started the workshop and I talked about how I didn't have teachers and I self-taught, that's going to take you forever. It took me a really long time because it's trial and error. So I would highly suggest, I'm sure that there is multiple TikTokers out there who really got good during COVID. And now they put out videos of like how to do things. So I would highly suggest either YouTube videos or TikTok videos. I think that there also is potentially I've done beading workshops online via Zoom, and I honestly feel like those ways to engage as well are helpful and beneficial, even if you're not specifically with a teacher in physically. Engaging over the internet, because you're able to ask questions, you're able to engage, those type of things. So I would highly suggest doing those things. And then also too, just play around. Like one of the main teachings that I often always share is don't be afraid to make mistakes, because that's how we learn, right? Those are Indigenous teachings right there, is that when you go to ceremony, right? That's the first teaching that I learned when I went to ceremony, is don't be afraid to make mistakes. And you're gonna make mistakes. Don't go out looking to make mistakes, but you definitely will make some mistakes. So that's the spirit bead teaching again, right?
Yeah,
circles, so
definitely, yeah, and just like being kind to yourself, like
for sure, yeah, that's that inner self dialogue, right?
Yeah.
And if you make mistakes, that's how you learn, right?
Yeah.
And those are even like, let's talk philosophically, right? Like that's how we learn in our lifetime, even, right? Is through learning mistakes, and those are our traditional ways of thinking, right?
Yeah. Well, I know even like learning that perfectionism is a characteristic of white supremacy. So,
absolutely, yes, that's
just
definitely
start unlearning that one.
Eurocentric worldview. Yeah, that's colonialism right there for sure. Yeah.
And then I think this is our last question, and then we just have someone just sharing that one last thing. Two more things. Was beading traditionally part of the West Coast Indigenous culture?
I can't say because I'm not from the West Coast, but from what I have read, button blankets, weaving, cedar, all of those things, carving, like those are traditional forms. I mean, dentilium shells, like, come on, like how many people do I have them on today? No, I don't. But those, again, when we think about those trading, earlier somebody asked about trade beads, right? We traded our things. So when you think about prior to contact, that's how it was, right? And that integration or that adaptation, because nothing ever stays the same. Indigenous people are very good at adapting, and we can see that, we gravitated towards beading, right? Because of our traditional practices, right? So I even know tons of people from the West Coast now who do beading, right? It's like something that's coming in, right? But those traditional forms of beading and weaving, even if they're not with glass beads, they are our traditional ways, right?
Definitely. And this last person, this is a First Nations woman whose story is part of the 60s scoop. They also self-taught themselves beadwork 5 years ago and shared their knowledge with other Indigenous folks, and they're continuously doing that. So,
wonderful.
Yeah, we have more champions out there,
and we can see that it's real, right? That it's true. That this is how we're going to strengthen our communities. This is how we're going to build those relationships. This is how we're going to, move out broader into the broader community and make those impacts. Because I can't teach all the beading workshops, guys.
No,
right? Can't do this work by myself. We can't do this work by ourselves, right? So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
And thank you and everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much for the amazing discussion. I loved learning more. I think it's just very meaningful and awesome to hear just validation for all the stuff we already know. I think when you constantly have all this research from a deficit basis from non-Indigenous folks, it's really hard to move forward. But then when you have your strong Indigenous leaders paving the way, it's this is why I keep doing it, So I'm really happy that we got to have a conversation today and connect. And did you have any last closing remarks before I close the webinar off?
No, I just want to say thank you again for inviting me here today to share some of the work that I do, and I appreciate it. Again, very grateful to be here.
And just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming webinars. We have one on December 12th. It is Engaging with Coming Faces Through the Past with Dr. Talena Atfield. Then we have Red River Jigging. That is on January 14th. And then we have Indigenous Health Administration and Leadership Program information session on January 16th. And all of our webinars are free to sign up for on our website at www.learningcircle.ubc.ca. And we have our newsletter. It'll be linked in our chat, so if anyone wants to sign up, it's there. And thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you all at our next Learning Circle. Lim, thank you.